we have a little bit of time to discuss 5 amazing papers. Unfortunately, I hope the digestive consequences of having lunch is not too complicated right now to handle. But in any case, I am pleased to introduce our 5 speakers today and our 5 projects. And after the panel that we had this morning, looking across the Atlantic, now we have a panel on the circulation of illiberal ideas, think tanks, and thinkers. So we'll look at how illiberal ideas influence politics and politicize in general. We have Thomas Gold from Brown University joining us online, and he will present first his work on neoliberalism and translation, ideological diversity across right-wing think tanks in Latin America. Presentation will be by Nastasa Kelvenek of the CNRS CSSP of Paris, working on Polish think tanks and its illiberal networks, anti-gender diplomacy and local political leverage, looking at, for example, Ordo Iuris as a good case study. And then we have Anemona Constantine, fellow at Sevepol University Libre de Bruxelles, looking at intellectuals between conservative liberalism and liberal conservatism, the cases of Center for European Renewal and the Action Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. And last but not least, of our 5 projects today, we have Perrine Scheer, Rouen University in France, and George W. here, working on cultural and social capital as a tool for illiberal promotion. How Jean Raspail and Michel Houellebecq disseminate illiberal ideas through novels. So as you can see, we talk about many different aspects of the diffusion of illiberal ideas, and we have many different contexts. At the end, hopefully, we have enough time to have Q&A, so hopefully 30 minutes to discuss. So get your questions ready, and then I hope that we can start now with the first presentation by Thomas Gold, who is joining us online.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. So, thank you for accepting my paper to this great conference. I think the topic, of course, is very timely. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at Brown, and I have been studying the Latin American right for quite a while. So what the work that I'm going to present today is mostly focused on transnational advocacy networks of free market think tanks in the region, think tanks that belong to what I call the free market right. So a combination of neoliberal ideology and positions with conservative positions in the social arena. So I just wanted to start with this a brief description of this event. This event took place this year in Buenos Aires, Argentina. It included the right-wing president, Javier Milei, along with other thinkers of the neoliberal right, both at the local level and the global level. And this was organized by the Cato Institute in partnership with Libertad y Progreso, or Liberty and Progress, which is a local think tank that was founded in the mid-2000s in Buenos Aires. Libertad y Progreso was funded not only by the Cato Institute, in this case, which organized the event, but also by the Atlas Network, as you can see below, since 2017. And is one of the think tanks, the local think tanks that has grown a lot during the last few years. So Atlas Network and the Cato Institute are not the only institutes that fund these partnerships with local think tanks in Latin America. In fact, I have some here in the screen, which belong to the US, Europe, especially Western Europe, the UK, Spain, and Germany. What these actors do is to generate partnerships with local think tanks in Latin America. And sorry, can you see my presentation? Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. This is the event that I was mentioning before, organized by Javier Milei and the local think tank Liberty and Progress, that is a partner of the Cato Institute and the Atlas Network. And these think tanks, Atlas Network, which is located in Virginia in the US, and the Cato Institute are both libertarian institutes from the US, but there are many other institutes across the West that finance partnerships in the Latin American region. And these partnerships are particularly developed with pre-market think tanks or right-wing think tanks in the region. So basically in this work, in the paper that I uploaded to the folder, I'm trying to unpack how these global neoliberal philanthropic foundations, such as the Atlas Network or the Cato Institute, establish stable partnerships with think tanks in the global South, in this case, Latin America. And when are these transnational connections more likely to succeed or fail in terms of helping these local think tanks to achieve their goals? So my focus is here on how Latin American think tanks sort of exploit these ties, these international ties in their favor. So based on the literature, the image that we have of these sort of transnational networks is several countries, especially in the global North, in the US and Western Europe, develop philanthropic foundations that want to expand this agenda overseas. They find partners in other countries of the world, and the number of think tanks in the global South has expanded dramatically during the 21st century, according to many measures. So they need to find partners in other countries in the global South that share their same agenda. And then they transfer resources and knowledge so a local think tank there can advance this agenda as well within another country. But the problem is that most of the work that we cite, especially in the literature on neoliberalism and the neoliberal right in Latin America, assumes that once these foundations, such as Atlas Network or the Cato Institute, sort of establish these partnerships with actors in the region, these directly translate into local influence. However, this literature hasn't provided much data on how that influence looks like and whether these international foundations are the reason why these local think tanks are successful. So as a couple of scholars put it in a study that is a bit old, but remains very relevant, although this global libertarian network that has connections to the illiberal networks that have expanded recently could draw on powerful ideas, these ideas do not necessarily translate into organizational presence and policy influence. So to return to the first case in the first slide, we don't know if that conference or that event organized with Javier Milei and some of the key people in the government really has an impact over, for example, policy and how that think tank exploits that relationship. So in this work, I present 3 reasons why I don't think the international influence is as important as the local influence that these foundations can develop. Or better said, why local think tanks establish ties with local actors, and those actors are far more influential than international actors in helping them to advance policy, for example. One is that most international networks need to share a very core set of beliefs to really advance a common agenda. And we have evidence that different styles of engagement and local policy traditions can destabilize these networks, right? So neoliberalism, although we assume that neoliberalism or illiberalism shares a sort of a core, very strong set of ideas, I will try to show that in Latin America, this is not always the case. Also, these foundations, such as the Atlas Network or the Cato Institute, we know that they develop partnerships with actors in Latin America, but we don't know much about how do they fund their partners and whether the way that they establish these partnerships influences the type of local influences that these think tanks can get, right? So we know that they have different organizational schemes to fund local advocacy efforts, but we don't know the consequences of those differences. And finally, we know from literature on development that there is a lot of competition, especially among NGOs, but also in this case, think tanks for international resources, right? And this can lead to increased conflict among local organizations, among themselves. We also know that many local NGOs and think tanks can develop this strategic branding, for example, as partners of the Cato Institute to get international funding, but this can be decoupled from local advocacy efforts that could be mainly could not lead to policy change. So for these three reasons, a difference in their ideas or the translation of the ideas between North and South, different governance structures and different types of behavior at the international and local arenas, I argue that these three issues can destabilize these international coalitions of illiberal actors or right-wing actors. So I will go fast through this, but for this work, I'm compiling a novel database of think tanks in Latin America and their international partnerships. So this is sort of network data. And then I interviewed most of the directors of think tanks in Argentina and Chile, along with directors of think tanks in many other countries, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, and Venezuela, who are in charge of developing these partnerships and maintaining them over time. I also conducted some archival data and participant observation in meetings that they organize or activities such as the one that I showed in the first slide. So sort of these international events that they organize in Latin America. So the first thing that I wanted to show is that although we tend to think of the free market right or right-wing actors in Latin America as very unitary, what my data showed is that they usually have ideological differences. So as this director of this think tank told me, they see very, very strong differences between a center-right liberal, a libertarian, and a conservative, right? And to show these differences, they show me this graph, which is called the Nolan chart, which is a libertarian device that was invented in the US in the 70s, which has on one axis personal freedom and on another axis economic freedom as variables. So as you can see, all of them positioned to the right of this chart, but they don't share the same degree of defense of personal freedom, right? They are all, in a way, very free market in nature, but they do not share personal freedom in the same way. So she tells me, that she is a center-right liberal, but of course, everything is a matter of degree, and depending on who you ask and which think tank you're looking at, their ideology might change a little bit. So when I was looking at the foundations that are mainly focused on funding the free market right in Latin America, I found that they have a lot of differences, ideological differences in the type of partners that they seek. And this leads to a lot of problems because they need to identify partners in Latin America, which is a very politically convoluted continent, that share their ideas. So for example, this director of a German foundation in Buenos Aires was telling me many liberals or even libertarians here in Argentina and in Chile are against the legalization of abortion, and they are quite aligned regarding this topic, but the foundation is for abortion, so this gets things complicated in terms of partnerships. Also, some topics are discussed in Argentina that are not even debated in Germany, so the German foundation doesn't have a clear position regarding those topics. Or environmentalism, right? This German foundation in Germany is, of course, acknowledges climate change, whereas many of its right-wing partners in Latin America do not, right? And this can lead to the destabilization of their partnerships. Many partnerships disappear over time, as I will show, and others change. So a very clear example that I wanted to show you, because I think it's closer to the topic of illiberalism, is the signing of the Madrid letter, which is a very important document proposed by the Spanish Illiberal Party Vox. This document was signed by most of the Latin American think tanks that are positioned to the right, but many of the German free market foundations that fund and finance these partnerships in the region rejected this letter because Vox didn't align with their position in Germany. So in a way, the degree of illiberalism of the partners is a matter of contention across these transnational advocacy networks in Latin America. I coded some documents to show that although we believe that these types of partnerships, for example, between the Cato Institute or the Atlas Network and partners in the regions are very stable, Actually, more than 50% of partnerships and funding lasts only 1 year. Some last 2, and only a handful last more than 3 years, right? So very few partners in Latin America, and we are talking about more than 150 think tanks, receive consecutive partnerships and funding over the years. So basically what I find in this paper is that if we map this as a network and we see the white squares, which are the foundations from the US and Western Europe, and the color nodes are the think tanks in Latin America, only a handful of Latin American think tanks have controlled the access to this international funding. They have developed very strong ties with these foundations, and they sort of hoard all of the international funding in their favor. What I discovered through qualitative research is that these organizations are the oldest in the region, and the neoliberal entrepreneurs that run them have developed this interpersonal trust with the staff from the global foundations. So paradoxically, this leaves not so much space for the new right to grow. So what I found is that roughly 50% of think tanks, of the new think tanks that are created, disappear or remain in survival mode, with international funding represented in between 50 and 100% of their budget. So because existing think tanks hoard all of the opportunities and local donors, it's very difficult, and disappeared across every country in the region. It's very difficult for new foundations to really start from scratch. There are some who were able to do it, but it's quite problematic for them. So for these new foundations, which are very small, international funding is sort of a patch for this week of organizations to survive for a few years. And on the other hand, there are 1 or 2 think tanks per country that hoard these international opportunities, but paradoxically, international funding represents between 3 and 15% of their budget. So international funding is mostly relevant to them because they already have strong local support. And this relates to something that I don't remember the scholar who was discussing this yesterday, but in Latin America, many countries have this long-standing tradition of free market right. So many of these old foundations that hoard this international funding are related to existing right-wing political parties or leaders. So what I'm trying to show in this research is that, of course, local think tanks can be influential and are influential, but these international philanthropic foundations are rarely the source of such influence in Latin America. And by that, I do not mean that foundations cannot serve as sort of diffusers of narratives and ideology, but at least in terms of resources and strategy making, they are not as influential as we tend to think. And with that, I think I'm over time. And yes, so thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much. We have so much to talk about. Unfortunately, we have already the next presentation. So on Poland, so Nastasa Kalwanek of the CNRS will present her work on Polish think tank and its illiberal networks, anti-gender diplomacy and local political leverage. Prepare your questions for the end of this panel, even if we have so much information, but I hope we will have lots of discussions. Thank you.
It's okay? Yeah. My today's presentation is devoted to the Polish think tank Ordo Iuris Institute for the Defense of Legal Culture, which was mentioned yesterday and several times during our conference. And these photos illustrate the 2 arenas, transnational and local, in which the think tank promotes and legitimizes anti-gender ideas. You can see the think tank president at the inaugural ceremony of Ordo Iuris branch in Spain, and also the think tank's expert presenting the abortion ban bill to the Polish parliament. I draw on Bourdieu's approaches focusing on the cooperation and struggle between elites within social fields, and in particular Polish researchers' concept of peripheral field of power, in which domination of some fractions of elites is consolidated through multipositionality or multiplication, and networks in overlapping social fields, and the legitimacy of peripheral elites depends on the validation from the central countries. And then I mobilize works focusing on the creation and the coordination of conservative legal thought centers. And finally, I draw on works that are situating gender issues in broader context of democratic backsliding. Namely, I mobilize the concept of opportunistic synergy between anti-gender actors and illiberal state. I asked two research questions. Firstly, how does Ordo Iuris use its transnational resources, multipositionality, and domestic political leverage to promote, support, and legitimize anti-gender policies in Poland and abroad? Secondly, to what extent do the transnational cooperation and local hegemony of anti-gender actors consolidate their positions in both the national field of power and the illiberal international? And my methodological framework includes a variety of empirical materials, prosopography of 49 current and historical Ordo Iuris members, observation of activist events, documentary sources like judicial, parliamentary, and media sources, social media and website, and 32 interviews. Some introductory remarks. Ordo Iuris was set up in 2013 as part of a transnational network of stemming from the Brazilian movement tradition, family and property, TFP, taking advantage of political leverage during the illiberal turn. Poland took after the Law and Justice Party came to power. It quickly experienced exponential ascent, and it was behind the abortion anti-abortion bill in 2016, blocked due to massive protests, and then promoted and legitimized the restriction on access to abortion decided by the Polish Constitutional Court in 2020. Ordo Iuris claims to have built its international reputation as one of the key centers for the defense of legal culture based on European civilization. Its hegemonic position was validated in 2021 when the Politico website included the Ordo Iuris president in its ranking of the 28 most powerful people in Europe, alongside Merkel and Macron, for example. Ordo Iuris describes itself as a legal independent think tank. Indeed, the typical think tank member is a lawyer, male under 40 years old, and a graduate of top-level Poland's universities. But the think tank is also a hybrid organization located at the meeting point between social fields, as 90% of its members are multi-positioned in the legal, political, and academic field, or academic field. My presentation explores its place within transnational and Polish illiberal networks and the interdependencies between the two. Firstly, on the transnational level, Ordo Iuris is part of an illiberal international composed of hundreds interconnected organizations around the world, uncovered by feminist and queer NGOs reports and the investigation of several journalists. There are three informal coalitions in the center of this chart: World Congress on Families, Agenda Europe, and TFP Network. As well as several important US headquartered NGOs having their branches worldwide. Financial links between organizations, even if in the case of Ordo Iuris, direct transfer of capital have not really been demonstrated. Co-presence during activist events in advisory bodies of international institutions and in the governing bodies of NGOs, and co-signatures of documents testify to a highly developed interdependence between these organizations. At the center of this network, we find the coalition of NGOs connected to Catholic and Spirit Tradição Família e Propriedade (TFP) movement. Pardon my Portuguese. Created in 1960 in Brazil. It is present in Poland since the 1990s and currently having its European headquarters in Poland. TFP is at the origin of the creation of the Piotr Skarga Foundation, which is the founding body of Ordo Iuris, and financially supports several network organizations. They often have the same lion logo. Some of them were created with the Ordo Iuris help and bear the same name. Long present in some Western countries, they proliferated, particularly Central and Eastern Europe, during the second decade of the 21st century, in the wake of the phenomenon that researchers have theorized as anti-gender campaigns, namely mobilization claiming to defend the traditional family, understood as a heterosexual married couple with children. Any deviation from the script, abortion, homosexuality, divorce, etc., is seen as a threat to the social order they aim to preserve. Although Vatican's reaction to gender equality being put on the UN agenda in the 90s is at the origin of the denunciation of gender as an ideology, the exponential development of TFP network is not totally correlated to the Catholic population rate. The map goes from gray, the fewest Catholic, to dark red, the most. The contestation of gender transcends its initial religious dimension, being as an integral part of the illiberal political project carried by actors who, like Ordo Iuris, are not directly linked to the Catholic Church. Three modalities of what I called anti-gender diplomacy are being deployed by coalition members. First is the network impacts local anti-gender campaigns, like, for example, the ratification process for the Istanbul Convention in the Czech Republic, which we discussed yesterday. On the one hand, they are involved in circulating ideas and repertoires of action. For example, a Polish branch of American NGO Human Life International participated in consultation for the Ordo Iuris 2016 abortion ban bill. On the other, they influence and legitimize policy making and judicial decisions. Speaking of Polish anti-abortion campaign, 30 members of this Illiberal International sent collective and individual opinions to the Polish Constitutional Court, the so-called Amisji Curie briefs, to legitimize the abortion ban ruling. Network members have different strategies in different countries. It probably stems from the place in the global system of the country in which the lobbying takes place, and then the place of local NGOs in the transnational network, which is of course connected with the local political level they have or not. Thus, Ordo Iuris makes extremely limited commitment in Western countries when conservative circles are powerful, while investing greater resources in peripheral ones, where thanks to its position as European leader, it supports local organization and contributes to the proliferation of anti-gender ideas. And because the legitimacy of peripheral elites depends on their validation from the central countries, the think tank members recognize the symbolic power of transnational support, particularly from countries with central position in world hierarchies like the US. Secondly, the network lobby in a global field of power. On the one hand, they try to penetrate policy making, the judicial process, and bodies of supranational and multilateral organizations. For example, 100 organizations from 15 countries addressed a letter to Macron to protest his proposal to include the right to abortion in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. The think tank has a massive use of Amisji Curie briefs in abortion cases before the ECHR. has consulting status in UN and EU institutions, and introduce its representatives to their advisory bodies thanks to support of local illiberal power. On the other, they initiate international convention and treaties, sometimes conflicting with existing international law, which was the case. Which was the case of their alternative to the Istanbul Convention, speaking about the abortion, which is the issue of the network. In 2020, Ordo Iuris and its counterparts contributed to set up the Geneva Consensus Declaration by 34 countries, including US, Poland, Brazil, and Hungary, stating that there is no international right to abortion. And thirdly, the members of this anti-gender network act as brokers among illiberal governments. Indeed, the relationship between the members of the network and their links with the bureaucratic field in their countries enable them to connect illiberal leaders. For example, connections between Ordo Iuris and the US headquartered Global NGO Alliance Defending Freedom, ADF, as well as the positions of these two organizations member in US, Brazil, and Poland governments, were at the origin of the relationships between illiberal leaders in these countries. Thus, these double linkages allowed Brazilian Secretary of State for the Family involved in this activity of ADF to meet Polish officials during her Ordo Iuris founded visit in Poland and facilitated the setting up of Geneva Consensus Declaration. While visiting Polish leaders and signing this anti-abortion declaration during 2020 massive protests against abortion ban in Poland, the network tried to legitimize Polish restrictive policies, but also paved the way for the American Supreme Court ruling overturning Roe versus Wade case in 2021. Of course, the brokering among illiberal leaders would be possible without the think tank taking advantage of national political leverage and its privileged position in Poland's illiberal network. It's quite finished. Finally, speaking of local linkages, as think tank Ordo Iuris has to keep a balance between gaining resources from the other fields in order to influence the field of power and the apparent independence that makes credible the neutrality of its expertise. Any signs of visible independence on founder or political interest groups threatens to undermine the think tank's claim to autonomy. In interviews they gave me, think tank members denied any linkages to illiberal leader, which is not true. In the interview, Ordo Iuris, in the interview to media, Ordo Iuris president tries to demonstrate the think tank independence from public founders, but explaining that the organization only is only financed by individual donors. However, a comparison of the organization's strategic identity and its real autonomy shows the that this apparent independence is compromised by the existence of a network of state academic institutions, think tank, NGOs, and law firms interconnected by multi-positions Ordo Iuris experts. More than 1 in 2 experts is a collaborator of another think tank or NGO. 40% have practiced as lawyer and judges, and also 40% have taught at least one of the 2 Ordo Iuris connected education institutions. Thus, even if the think tank received no funding directly from the states and public donors, its activity would be financed indirectly by them through the pooling of human and financial resources, as its member can be paid and work on the same issues under several affiliations as experts of other NGOs, lawyers, and academic researchers. And one of Ordo Iuris members is a member of the council of this National Freedom Institute, who is responsible for allocating public funding to the NGOs. The constitution of this network, as well as strategy of intimidation and delegitimization of progressive NGOs are part of strategy of elite renewal in civil society, and this self-funding and self-certification system with the university close to the Ordo Iuris makes the network more autonomous and independent from of this political leverage. Yeah, maybe it's okay, and maybe one more. And there are some positions they have in a field of power: ministers, Supreme Court judges, director of the Constitutional Law Department, advisor to the president, advisor to the prime minister, president of the National Commission of Pedophilia Cases, and 2 consultants in the Ministry of Health. And I will stop here.
Thank you so much. We could go on and go on with all these fascinating topics. I would introduce our next presentation. Intellectuals between conservative liberalism and liberal conservatism. The cases of the Center of European Renewal and of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty, presented by Anne-Mona Constantine, fellow at the Cevipol Université Libre de Bruxelles.
Thank you for having me here. I modified the title to make it more simple: conservative and liberal intellectuals in transnational networks. And the idea of this presentation and research project ongoing is to bring together, to bridge these 2 think tanks, which are the Center for European Renewal. Actually, it's a network of think tanks, conservative think tanks based in Europe, in Amsterdam, created in 2007, and the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty, which is a libertarian liberal think tank based in Michigan, and which was created in 1990. So some preliminary remarks I based my presentation on regard the distinctions between conservatism and liberalism. And what I would like to say is this distinction, it's not operated in absolute terms, but as certain actors also have defined it. My point of view is that this ideological distinction is always contingent. In 1916, the closing of the Constitution of Liberty, Friedrich Hayek, the famous Austrian economist, explains in 8 points why he is not a conservative, the distinctions between these 2 ideological trends. And he says that while conservatism is opposing change, it cannot offer, it never offers an alternative, while liberalism is more concrete, and it's more concrete in the sense that it's ideology who always move towards a more tangible horizon. This text is now online on the site of the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian institute based here in Washington, D.C. Robert Sirico, who is the president of and the founder of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty, in an interview I conduct with him in 2023, he would say something something similar, that he is not as far as the national conservative movement is concerned, it considers that it is too nationalistic, too heavily dependent on the state, almost fascistic, and a dangerous movement in general. On the side of the conservatives, they are doing the same distinctions. Roger Scruton, in a text from 2007 about Friedrich Hayek, a very readable text actually, he says that he's not agreeing or with this idea that the social, in Friedrich's perspective, social order is always based on the invisible hand of the free market, and he considers that Hayek overlooks some social arrangements rooted in traditional, and the virtue of these social arrangements always rooted in traditional morality, religion, and customs. So based on this very concrete, let's say, narratives, the scholarship on conservatives, sometimes they equate it with illiberalism, but I prefer to use the term conservatives because I'm operating with a constructivist perspective, and in general, with the self-identification of the actors, and I never met an conservative intellectuals who calls himself a liberal. So based on this, the scholarship on conservatism is underlying that this current is reactionary, anti-liberal, anti-alignment, anti-EU, anti-democratic. So assess the challenges to the liberal consensus of current conservatism. These accounts in general are very much focused on ideology and ideas. So the idea of this project is to say a bit more about the actors, the organization, their resources, and the relations between the organization. And from this perspective, to question the relationship between liberalism and conservatism, not only from an ideological point of view. Because in realities, liberals, libertarians, and conservatives do have ties. They have ties at different levels. They have common grounds in terms of values and principles, in terms of interpersonal relations, and also interactions between organizations do take place, and between networks. And what these interactions between networks, which seem so different in ideological terms, could say to us about the circulation of illiberalism. This is the main research question I'm trying to explore. So this is a bit the very ambitious scholarship I would like to mobilize, and to address some gaps in the literature on the sociology of the actors and their ideas, the connection between conservatism, liberalism, and illiberalism, and also operate with a comparative and transnational perspective. I'm very attached to the idea that conservatism is a co-production between actors coming from Central Eastern Europe. We focused on in general, but also actors who are coming from old established democracies. So these are my data, interviewed the actors, ethnographic fieldwork during the Vandenburg meetings of the Center for European Renewal, statistics that I would like to develop in the future, and the great literature produced by the actors and by these two think tanks. So the Center for European Renewal, I put the two of them here. I will not enter the details because it's a bit long, but what I wanted to share with you is that these two think tanks advocate for the same values. There is dignity of the person, family, very important, limited government, free market, subsidiarity. with the Acton Institute, as they are libertarians, so they are saying they are not conservatives. They are stressing very much on free market and not regulated, limited government, whereas the Center for European Renewal is stressing on civilization values, cultural values, and both of them on religion and free market, but in different proportions. The Acton Institute, I present a bit the political context in which these two organizations have been created. The two of them are linked to the fight against communism. The Center for European Renewal relies on contacts between conservatives from Eastern and Western Europe, which were established in the 80s, whereas the Acton Institute is the same, relies on networks which have been created in the 80s towards Latin America as well. The Acton Institute opposes the development of the liberation theology and the penetration of the liberation theology in the United States of America, starting with the 80s through someone called James Cone, who is who adapted the liberation theology to the Black movement for civil rights. So he elaborated the Black liberation theology, and they oppose this movement through the social doctrine of the church. I don't know if liberation theology is based on the application of maxims to religion. I don't enter into the details. And the social doctrine of the church tries to adapt liberalism and religion. This doctrine has been elaborated by John Paul II, starting with the 90s and the fall of the communist regime. It relies also on the expansion of the society of Mont Pelerin, the neoliberal society, from Europe to the United States and to Latin America in the context of the Washington Consensus, and I will stop here. While the Center for European Renewal has been created after the EU enlargement to the East, and in a context of mobilization for the memory of communism, the recognition of the memory of communism in Europe. So the two have these anti-communist and religious grounds. These are the actors, but I don't want to show you this because it will be too long. These are the networks of these two. The Acton Institute have an office in Rome and are actually successful networks in Guatemala through the Fe Libertad Institute and in Argentina, while the Center for European Renewal is mostly European and US. The organizations are based in US and in Europe. Here is a map. And yes, I want to bring out the connection between the two, even if those two are so different, or they are saying are so different in ideological terms. There were interaction at different moments that I identify until now. In 1991, Father Sirico traveled to Europe and established connections with Roman Joch, which is one of the founder of the Center for European Renewal. They were others connection took place in the mid 2000. Roger Scruton was invited several times, who is the leading figure of the Center for European Renewal, was invited several times by the Acton Institute in conferences. The Acton Institute participates into the conferences of the NatCon, and my impression is that they are looking for a new life for fusionism in the United States. And in 2003, the members of the two of these organizations reunited in the Zagreb in Croatia during a conference where they discussed the relevance of the Chilean economic model for Europe. Also, in terms of ideas, they have some common grounds. Some of the actors are not all the time conservative or liberals. They are evolving. Roger Scruton, who was a cultural conservative in the 80s, open to liberalism. Later on, whereas Robert Sirico, who was a Marxist, became liberalist in the mid-80s and more conservative now. He opposed gay marriage. He performed the first gay marriage in Colorado in '75, and in 2009 he signed the Manhattan Declaration against gay marriage. So these actors evolve in terms of ideas, and maybe they are crossing in the middle. They are both of them looking to regulate free market through religion. They have interest in economy. The Center for European Renewal, it's, we say in general that he is very much engaged in cultural wars, but during the Vandenberg meeting, what I saw there is that they are very much involved in economic wars as well, because they are criticizing woke capitalism, neoliberalism. They are opposed, both of them, to Marxism. And I think in terms of interest and resources, these two organizations have some common grounds. And yes, I wanted to show a bit some characteristics. The women are very few compared to men in both organizations. And there are also some common characteristics in terms of education, philosophy, theology, economics and finance, not here, but for the Acton Institute are very much present. They are having the actors are multi-positioned for the two of this organization. And to conclude what I wanted to say with all this is that these two organizations are maintaining a strategic and ideological ambivalence, and that this it's not because they don't agree that they do not dialogue, they are communicating, and maybe that this alliance, which is not perfect from an ideological point of view, relies on some social affinities, some similarities in terms of also education, and on interest in terms of funding, and also transfer of resources like respectability from the liberals toward the conservative circle. And maybe to understand the circulation of illiberalism, we should be aware of the fact that when the framework is softer, I mean, when this strategic ambivalence is possible, maybe it allows illiberalism to circulate and allows more appropriations by different kinds of actors. Thank you.
Thank you everybody, that we are very much in time. And we have now our last presentation entitled Cultural and Social Capital as a Tool for Illiberal Promotion, How Jean Raspail and Michel Houellebecq Disseminate Illiberal Ideas Through Novels, by Perrine Scheer of Rouen University in France and George W. University. Thank you.
Thank you. So my colleagues on the panel have analyzed the different ways in which illiberal ideas can circulate within political areas, within the political world. For example, with think tanks, with political thinkers, What I would like to do today, what I would like to elaborate on, is that concept of illiberal diffusion or illiberal promotion, as I have been calling it, and ask the question, how else can illiberal ideas be diffused and promoted within society? So while my colleagues focused, as I said, on political culture, I wanted to focus on ideas that are not considered political per se, ideas that are not within the political realm. And so, for example, in this case study, I want to show how illiberal ideas can be diffused or promoted by fiction and novels in particular. So there are novels that are known for being associated with far-right culture. So I will take here the example of the Camp des Saints in French, or Camp of Saints, which has been written in 1973 by Jean Raspail, for those who know it. So in the small part of society that actually read Raspail, these are illiberal ideas being diffused in those type of far-right areas. But there are also novels that diffuse the same illiberal ideas in very much mainstream areas. So in the case study here, I took the example of Michel Houellebecq's 2015 Soumission in French and Submission in English. So both Raspail's Camp des Saints and Houellebecq's Soumission are both social science fiction novels. They both have similar narratives. They both engage with the idea of the Great Replacement, of the erosion of what is supposed to be a French or European identity. They both portray France's white, supposedly native population as being on the brink of extinction. But despite these very similar themes, the two authors have experienced vastly different reception. So while Houellebecq's Soumission has gained significant traction in the mainstream area, and in mainstream culture, it is sold at at the end cap of every bookstore. On the other hand, Raspail's Camp of Saints is very much a niche far-right type of novel, which is only referred to by far-right political figures. So this presentation is based on a soon-to-be published paper, hopefully, and I'm going to, so in the next few weeks, and my aim here is to explore why such a divergence can occur between those two novels, and more importantly, how does Houellebecq manage to gain such a significant traction in mainstream area and such widely accepted public acceptance, and so how does he bypass the mainstream gatekeepers that could keep those ideas in the same far-right realm as Raspail? So, as I mentioned earlier, those novels share many similar themes. So both engage with replacement narratives, both suggest that this will lead to the extinction of the French and European identity. In Houellebecq's Soumission, this is by so-called Islamization. In Raspail, Camp of Saints, it happens through mass immigration and racial mixing. Both narratives extends this type of invasion to not only France, but also Europe, suggesting that it's all of Europe that will be overtaken. Both novels also depict this invasion as largely non-violent, meaning that they depict the left liberal parties as having facilitated this invasion. Both also blame the media for hiding the true, quote-unquote, nature and the true dangers of immigration. And finally, both engage with racial themes. So in Raspail, this is very much overt, and he frequently mentions the idea and the existence of a white race. in Welbeck, he alludes to race, he mentions race a few times, but he talks more about a civilization. So as mentioned earlier, despite those similarities in themes and in the narrative, they enjoyed a very different reception. So to summarize, Welbeck has enjoyed mainstream popularity. He has won many prestigious literary prizes. He was even considered for the 2022 Nobel Prize of Literature. And in contrast, Raspail has been very much associated with the far-right realm. For example, he's one of the books that is recommended to read by both Marine Le Pen, but also Bannon. It is also one of the most famous books in white nationalist, like far-right bibliography. So my hypothesis here is that this discrepancy between Raspail and Welbeck and their very different reception can be understood through their different use of capital in the sense of Bourdieu's capital. I will talk about that more like in a minute. But more specifically, Welbeck's success lies in his ability to leverage this capital. So I will talk about social capital and what I call discursive capital. Then enabling him to legitimize his work in mainstream circles, whereas Raspail didn't have this capital and so wasn't able to legitimize his ideas. So let's take a closer look at those two types of capital. So first is social capital. So in the case of Welbeck, this is his connections to the media and to the literary world and critics, and also the academic world. So Welbeck leverages the social capital to ensure that his work is going to be received, commented on, appreciated in a way that aligns with his own objectives. So by strategically intervening in the media, Welbeck shapes the public narrative around his novels, and so therefore influences how his books are being discussed. So I will argue that this is key to his success in basically evading direct criticism of the political content of the books. So while the literary contents and the aesthetic qualities of the books are mentioned and talked about, the political contents is usually not talked about. So this was for the first type of capital, social capital, so connections, networks. The second type of capital I will talk about is what I call discursive capital, for lack of a better word yet. So what I call discursive capital is kind of a new take on what Bourdieu calls linguistic capital. So for Bourdieu, linguistic capital is the legitimate language recognized and valued by institutions. For example, universities, school, media, etc. But in my case, what I want to describe is not only language, but socially unacceptable ideas. So I want to describe his ability to reformulate, for example, racist, sexist, homophobic ideas into like notions, expressions that are palatable or at least tolerated within the boundaries of the mainstream discourse. So to capture this kind of additional layer involved in the process, I propose this concept of discursive capital, which would mean not only a mastery of language, but also an understanding of the implicit rules governing what can and cannot be said in a particular context. So basically, not only linguistic resources, but ideological resources as well of what is considered normal or acceptable. So to position this paper's theoretical framework, I propose the following hypothesis. So first, Welbeck's success in gaining public acceptance can be attributed to his strategic manipulation of discursive and social capital. And conversely, Raspail's failure to achieve the same recognition can be attributed through his lack of social and discursive capital. Secondly, so on a wider angle, the successful navigation of mainstream spaces depends basically not only on the content of the books, but also on the strategic use of capital to legitimize it. Or said differently, cultural acceptance depends on how effectively an individual can manipulate the forms of capital to gain legitimacy from key gatekeepers like critics, media, academic institutions, etc. And third, my third hypothesis here is that I consider those strategic manipulation of capital as a practice of what I called illiberal promotion. So I use the concept of practice here because my focus is not, as I said, on the content of the novels, like the common themes I mentioned earlier, like replacement, etc. But my focus is not on the content, but on the practices involved in content diffusion and practices involved in content promotion. So I will give examples of two of those type of practices. So the first is what I called intratextual practices, so within the text. So how ideas are formulated within the text to fit dominant norms. And also, so that's the first type. And the second type is extra-textual practices. So how authors ensure a favorable reception by controlling external factors, such as media coverage, institutional networks, etc. So my focus here is that rather than adopting a comparative approach that would, for example, classify regimes as being illiberal, or like a more poetical theory approach that would use illiberalism as a doctrine or as a homogenized ideology, what I propose to follow here is what we call in France, histoire sociale des idées, so social history of political ideas, which is basically, it means defining political ideas in a much broader sense, including representations, attitudes, beliefs, narratives. And this approach, it enables me here to detect politics into unexpected places, for example, here in fiction and novels. So the main idea of this social history of political ideas is that political ideas are not limited to political programs, political speeches, or even political essays. They can also be expressed through actions and attitudes of fictional characters. So this broader lens enables us here to nuance the understanding of how political ideas circulate within society. So not only from political arenas to another, but actually also from the cultural to the political and backwards. So I will now give, unfortunately, only one example of how Welbeck uses this capital. You are welcome to come see me after for the second one. So I will use here the way he uses his social capital. So most of his social, like Welbeck's social capital is used in extra-textual practices. So how he ensures that he has a favorable reception by controlling external factors like media coverage. So one example of this strategic use of social capital is the complete control Welbeck has over his public image. So first, he maintains a strategic ambiguity towards his political alignment. So he's as close to left-wing media like Les Inrocks, for example, and also to far-right media like Valeurs Actuelles. And so Les Inrocks, so this left-wing media, had a capital importance in building this left-wing image because they only saw in Welbeck what they wanted to see, which was a criticism of capitalism, economic neoliberalism, the individualism, the loneliness, the anomie that can kind of be drawn out of that. And so this identification as being left-wing, he owes it also to his editor, who crafted this very specific promotional plan for every book launch, which was, every book launch was always crafted to have a majority of left-wing newspapers and only one of right-wing newspapers. So in conclusion, what I wanted to talk about here is that through his use of social capital, Welbeck actually limits the autonomy of the critics, and how the public can freely react to his work, and creates basically a controlled environment where certain criticism are discredited. And so thus his ability to avoid the same fate as Raspail illustrates how this strategic manipulation of capital, so here social capital, can act as a tool for illiberal promotion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. This was an amazing panel presentations with many different aspects of contexts and actors of the diffusion of illiberalism and its ideas. I'll just pose a first question to abuse of my role as a chair, and it will be more of a journalistic question. And feel free, obviously, all of you to reply to it to the extent that you've already had empirical findings. But I was wondering, because we have so many different papers here, what were your biggest surprises in terms of empirical findings when you conducted your research on your different projects? You want to start?
No. Okay, for me, it was like on a human level, I was really scared to interview these people whose opinions I completely opposed to mine. And like humanly, they are really kind. And it was like a biggest surprise to me. And also like I have occasion to visit the headquarters of the organization, like which is really they showed me the university of founded by Ordo Iuris, and yeah, it was really, I think maybe on human level, because if not like interviews, it was mostly for like understand the relational links they have, because they mostly like repeat the same thing in media, but it was like my goal is to understand how they are linked to other organizations, and it explained me that. Yeah.
Somebody else wants to talk about surprises? In any case, we can start already the Q&A session. We have 30 minutes, so many hands. And if you, in the meanwhile, have some ideas about your discoveries, feel free to add them, obviously. So I would start with 3 first questions, maybe, and then we group them, and then we'll try to redistribute. So I see first row here, and then maybe the gentleman left side, and the third question, and there. So Maria, you want to start?
Yeah. Hi, thank you very much. My name is Maria. I'm based in Berlin. I come from a think tank scene, so maybe I have a bit different approach. I have 7 million questions to all of you. Thank you for fantastic presentations, but I have to limit myself to 2. And I will ask Natasha and Anemona questions. And Natasha, thank you very much for engaging with Ordo Iuris. And I was wondering if you could trace their activity after the new government has taken over in Poland in December last year. Like, guess I'm asking about your last slide, which probably needs an update. Like, Paweł Jabłoński is not the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, right? So could you track how the strategy of Ordo Iuris has changed once they lost this state sponsorship or this, the patronage of a party in power? And the other question is, you've been mentioning the gender imbalance in illiberal think tanks, and can you see this changing as well? So there are women, like token women, in those movements or organizations very often, also in political parties like Le Pen, Alice Weidel in Germany, and so on. But do you see these illiberal ideas, which, for example, like with access to abortion, women's rights, are conflicting women's rights. Is there a paradox of more and more women joining these movements and joining these organizations, supporting? Can you see this, or is it just tokenism with having, like, you know, some women to represent conservative ideas? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Ethan. I'm a freshman here at GW. My question's mainly directed towards Dr. Kelvenich. The organization that you mentioned, Ordo Iuris, has pretty clear links to Law and Justice, and a lot of illiberal organizations like that have links to other far-right parties in Europe. Should, with a lot of the kind of traditional center-right parties now starting to embrace a lot more right-wing conservative ideals, potentially illiberal ideals, particularly in Austria, France, the Netherlands, and Sweden, should people be worried that organizations like this will wield more influence over policymaking in traditionally more socially liberal countries?
Hi, I'm Jeremy. I'm based here in DC. I work in the democracy and governance space. My question is for Tomas specifically, two related questions. So, as you note, yeah, there's a wide ideological variety of these think tanks that you survey in Latin America. And from my somewhat limited knowledge of the topic, a fair amount of them are quite committed to liberal democracy. So given that, I was curious as to why, in relation to the democratic issue, you chose to focus on neoliberalism rather than illiberalism. And the second is that given the diversity among these think tanks, do you feel that any of them could possibly be engaged in the struggle for democracy in Latin America?
Wants to start?
Yes, thank you very much, Maria, for this question. Actually, I worked a bit on this, and yes, they are looking for gender balance, which is a paradox. Actually, the organizer of these Vandenberg meetings, because it's very hard to penetrate these circles, I've been recommended by someone, so I've been very lucky to get to assist to these meetings. And they told me, I posed the question to the organizer, why you've been, how you selected me. And he said, well, you are a woman and we need more women. So this was kind of this gender, question of gender balance also is something that in a paradoxical way, it's like for alignment, there are some studies now who are looking to the alignment period, and they are showing that also the counter-revolution, it's also influenced by the alignment. So this liberalism and illiberalism are entangled at some point. And also there are women there. We see some divisions concerning the role of women, because you have a group of feminist, right-wing feminist, conservative women who are relating to the first wave of feminism, not to the gender theory. They are for the differentiations between men and women, of course, but they are advocating the revalorization of the women's role in society, and they are elaborating a sort of ideological canon, transnational ideological canon of feminism, with a tradition of monastic writers and American right-wing feminists, which are very much quoted and present in the discussions, while the men there have a very patriarchal views on the role of women. So I assisted some tensions. It was really interesting. And for the surprise in terms of empirical finding, what struck me was First of all, the fact that they are very skeptical and they are afraid of critical to be criticized from outside. This is something very very present. And the second point, in terms of, I've been surprised to see that they are actually very much engaged in building a community, a social community, in terms of friendship, of brotherhood almost. And this, I never saw this in the left-wing circles. It was very different what I experienced in France.
Yes, the current situation is different for them, and they like are deprived of this founding they have before. Also, I think because these transnational networks are connected to Russian capital with the war in Ukraine, for me, I think it will be complicated for all of them. And Ordo Iuris, because I'm like say abonné. I'm subscriber of their net they mail, yes, newsletters, so thank you, and they inform about like financial difficulties they have actually, and also I think the reports of feminist and LGBT plus NGOs inform the public about the connection with this abortion issue, and also their opposition to same-sex marriage, etc. And they have less donors also. But they have also this system of self-founding, which I explained, and also this system of self-certification with their universities, and it's quite like closed. Yeah. I think that the point is American election for all this network. It's a big issue, I think. And in Poland, of course, they like lost all their positions in the government, and yeah, it's they don't have this influence they have before. Links to it was the question. Yeah, they are. I forgot. It's you. They are very critical to like neoliberalism. They considers that they are critical to liberal elites, which is a little bit surprising. They are elites too, with this top level university. They are all like very rich people and living in Warsaw, etc., etc. And they consider themselves as conservatives, and have this strong opposition to all liberal ideas, and perceived like national identity of Poland as like maybe national community which excludes like feminist, liberals, and all the people who for them are like importing Western ideas.
Maybe we give the floor to Tomasz online to reply to his questions.
Sure, thank you for the questions. This panel was super interesting. So I agree that there is this wide ideological diversity in think tanks, and you asked me about, why neoliberalism and not illiberalism. In the paper, I actually use another word, which is the free market right, because they rarely see themselves as illiberal, and sometimes the category for me complicates a little bit the ideological spectrum in Latin America, because many think tanks, but also political elites in Latin America, see themselves as defenders of liberalism, which is an ideological tradition that has been pretty weak in the region. And they see themselves as liberals against leftist populist tendencies in the region, right? So this is a key difference when we talk about like illiberalism in Europe versus Latin America, because most illiberal actors in Latin America that sort of are trying to undermine democracy combine free market ideas with conservative social values in different ways, but that is different from this sort of chauvinistic, nationalistic flavor of the European right, because they are quite neoliberal in their policy agenda. And there is certain commitment to liberal democracy, but they are not always quite committed. I study, this project is sort of embedded in a comparison of think tanks in Argentina and Chile. And I have also been studying Brazil. And in these three cases, Milei in Argentina, Cast in Chile, and Bolsonaro in Brazil, they were surrounded by think tanks that usually present themselves as liberals or neoliberals, but many of them are illiberal in their strategies. So, there is variation also in the commitment to liberal democracy. And your second question was related to this. So are these think tanks committed to the struggle for democracy in Latin America? I think not always. And it varies across the three categories that I have found, this category of libertarians, center-right, and conservatives. And those categories vary by country. So it's a very complicated sort of map, ideological map of the region. But I would say that because right-wing parties in the region are usually traditionally weaker than in other regions, many times these actors engage in coalitions very pragmatically and opportunistically. And that is quite dangerous because in Latin America, as in many other regions today, the center-right is aligning with the liberal options that are perhaps more radical. And Latin America is not the exception. So I think this speaks to this issue of connecting the study of these illiberal ideas with the study of the existing coalitions that come closer to those ideas, which is, I think it was mentioned in all the presentations, but the study of Venezuela that presented today is perhaps one of the best examples of that, right? Thank you.
Next round of questions. So I see 2 hands here. Maybe we could get the mic starting here on the right. And then the gentleman on the right.
I'm interested in whether anyone's noticed multinationals funding far-right parties, because there's records, including by Quinn Slobodian, of the supposedly free market think tanks supporting the far-right parties, but there's also some research to show AT&T and companies like that directing money to the far-right parties. And you can see in the resource-rich region of Australia and New Zealand that neoliberal forces have got a lot of interest in illiberalism. Atlas Network think tanks actually in government in New Zealand, and suppressing protests that gets in the way of profits from fossil fuels.
Thank you so much for your interesting presentations. My question would be for Antonio and Marian. I come from Georgia myself, which is a growingly autocratizing country. And the problem I've seen with opposition there is that, in fact, they get labeled as illiberal and authoritarian for taking extra institutional measures against the ruling party. So they either resort to boycotts or street protests or hunger strikes or so on, because they don't believe that working within the institutions would do any good and would actually legitimize these governments that they believe have captured the state. So I was wondering, where would you situate those practices done by opposition parties? Would that be illiberal? And yeah, thank you.
Hello, this is for Dr. Kalvenich again. In your study of the TFP as a European think tank, what have you found are the links between the TFP as a think tank and the TFP as an activist organization active in cities across the United States with local chapters there?
Yeah. Ask a question. Yeah, thanks. Fascinating panel. Thank you so much. A question for Perrine. Perrine, could you develop a little bit more on how the change in the televisual landscape in France has been influencing the normalization? Here we know, well, Fox News, of course, but France is also getting its own local Fox News, French version. So how this kind of right-wing, if not far-right television channel are playing a role in kind of changing, what is normalizable on the case of especially Welbeck. That was not there maybe for previous times. And the role of big tycoons that are launching these French far-right channels. Thank you.
This is also for Perrine. I had a question, about if Welbeck's strategy is, pretty established at this point. First, have you seen other authors on the right start to emulate it as a way to try to break into the publishing space? I'd be curious to hear about that. And then second, for dead authors, I'm thinking of, authors of the French right of the interwar period, like Céline or Brasillach. Like, have you seen publishing houses try to use similar strategies to help aid the recirculation of those sorts of works, or is that kind of a separate phenomena?
Maybe we start replying to some of the questions. Who wants to start?
Sure. I just want to say something really quick. Yeah, so great question. And what we've tried to do in this paper is to focus far more on intra-opposition dynamics. So, and sometimes that relates to its relationship to the regime, right? So in as much as these practices and ideas are designed to overrun other parties, to suppress pluralism, for example, that is how we label them as an illiberal in the political sense, right? So we have, like Thomas said, so there's a whole other world in the economic liberal agenda, which is generally embraced. But in as much as the practices are within the opposition alliance, sometimes exerting extra institutional methods is, we don't condemn it that immediately a priori. What we do is, in as much as it's done to overcome consensus building mechanisms within the opposition, and suppress minority or even majority sometimes agreements within the opposition itself. So that's where we are at this point. But we've discussed these strategies in other papers too. So I don't know if you want.
Yeah, maybe just to complement, the literature, as you might know, on the type of strategies is growing and has grown, and that's obviously amazing. Well, I work in opposition, so I have a bias. But the motives and the drivers and the explanations as to why some groups promote one set of strategies over the others, that's where we need to focus more, I think, towards the future. It is possible that there is an overlap between, let's say, more elite-driven or conservative elites promoting boycotts. It's just a hunch, so I haven't systematically thought about this, but it might not be the only reason why. And I think our paper, as Antonio said, will only contribute to that discussion in the sense that illiberalism would be, an illiberal strategy would be one that is imposed onto others without discussions, which we see oftentimes, right? Like, particularly during interview data collection, that was a big thing, and people blaming each other. I wasn't told, I didn't know, this was imposed, particularly government, there is enough evidence now, internationally and domestically, that it was created by a very small group and then imposed on the rest. So in that sense, I mean, that was also, it was an extra institutional path, I would say, even though it was set to be within the institutions because it was part of the National Assembly. In the end, it got extended way above, I think, 2 years, if I'm not mistaken, extending the length of the parliament, which shouldn't have happened. So there is an overlap, but it's not the main focus of the paper.
Your question about TFP. I think this movement is really interesting because they have like two branches, two type of activities. There are this very highly professionalized branch like Ordo Iuris and all these like networks of lawyers. They have this very controlled and very efficient use of speech, reappropriation of human rights language. If you don't know who they are, it sounds quite good, and they like names of organization as legal culture, Ordo Iuris. It's very often like Latin names. And you have like a more popular branch, I would see. I would say they organize protests before hospitals or giant exposition with photographs of aborted fetus, etc. And they have I also do some interviews with them, and they have a very like free speech about murders of children, and for example, Ordo Iuris members will speak about abortion. And about, I don't know, if a doctor is fired by the hospital because he didn't do the abortion well, he had to do. They will talk about I don't know, employees' rights or something like this. It's not the same type of organizations, and to my knowledge, they are not at all present in the U.S. TFP. There is like American organization, but not being part of this movement.
Thank you for your questions. Yeah. Okay. So I will answer Marlene's question first. So closer. That better? Awesome. Okay, so about the role of like the Fox News version in France, and so the role of Bolloré, for example. So Bolloré in France, as you might know, has purchased several media outlets. So he's purchased CNews, which is like the French version of Fox News. He's also purchased so the whole of Canal+, so all of the TV that comes with that. And he also purchased the Journal du Dimanche, which used to be like a center right-wing newspaper. So within all of those, you have now people that were put in place by Bolloré that are closely related to Welbeck, for example. So, for example, the JDD, so the Journal du Dimanche, is now headed by Geoffroy Lejeune, who used to be director of the Valeurs Actuelles, the far-right newspaper I mentioned earlier. And what is interesting here is that Geoffroy Lejeune has a very close relationship to Welbeck, and Welbeck owes Lejeune a lot. For example, you might know that Welbeck received the Légion d'honneur, so the Medal of Honor, by President Macron, of all person, in 2019. And so this happened thanks to Lejeune. So Lejeune is a really close friend of Bruno Roger Petit. For those who might know it, he's a close advisor to Macron, and he's in charge of like memory and also in charge of awards like this Medal of Honor. So Lejeune talked about Welbeck not having received that medal yet to Bruno Roger Petit, who brought it up with Macron. Macron agreed, and then 6 months later, Welbeck received this Medal of Honor, for example. So this is one example. Another example is how Welbeck is also widely circulated by Canal+. So Welbeck is known for his books, but he also is increasingly, so he's done some music. Some of his poems have been put into music by, for example, Carla Bruni, the previous First Lady when the president was Sarkozy. And so he also appeared in numerous movies, and all of them were financed and then put in place by Canal+. And there is actually also rumors for the moment of a TV show based on Soumission that is supposed to come out by Canal+ in the next 2 years. So that should be interesting also. So yeah, so within the whole Bolloré era and all of these circles, there are, of course, powers in place that also participate into that proliferation of Welbeck being everywhere. On that second question, on the emulation of Welbeck strategy, of course, so many authors follow this strategy. I will name one in particular. I don't know if you've heard of Laurent Auberton. He wrote, so his most famous book is La France Orange Mécanique, so Clockwork Orange France. And so Auberton is actually really close to Welbeck. They used to be in contact, and so he was kind of his protege for a while. And so he clearly took the same route and also has the same kind of red-brown political positioning that makes him unplaceable, kind of on a political scale, or at least kind of makes the tracks less easy to follow. So that's one example. And then on the recirculation of Céline or other interwar authors, of course, not only Céline, but for example, we mentioned some of the authors of the German conservative revolution. These are coming back in style big time, but still in France, to my best knowledge, still published by far-right publishing houses.
I had a brief comment.
Sure.
No, there was a question about that I had a brief response to about neoliberalism and illiberalism, especially in Australia and the Atlas Network connection. I agree because many think tanks in these neoliberal networks are converging into illiberalism because neoliberal traditions did not have ever a strong commitment towards democratic institutions, unless those institutions are very minimalist. But I just wanted to show with my work that when we tend to say, Atlas Network think tanks are in power, for example, in Australia or in Argentina, based on what I saw in Latin America, most of these think tanks operate at the local level, right? And sometimes Atlas Network is not very crucial for their efforts. So I just feel like, a lot of work on neoliberalism sees these think tanks that are connected to the Atlas Network as sort of the Atlas Network getting into local governments, right? And many times these think tanks have been there for 20 years and they have been developing advocacy efforts, and the funding from Atlas Network is not even that relevant in their overall budget. So I'm not saying that, of course, that's the case of Australia, because I don't know. But I just feel like we could, as scholars, we should go deeper into the countries and see what these think tanks are doing with those connections, right? Instead of always assuming that these connections are translated into local influence instead.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. We would love to spend more time with you, obviously, but unfortunately, time is running out. We have a coffee break here now for half an hour, and then we have our last panel of this conference about cross-national comparison and transnational actors at 3:30. So please engage, obviously, with our authors, and thanks again for your presentations.